Hello, I'm Sergeant Be Safe. Have you ever wondered if there's any questions that cops absolutely hate to hear? Well, here's a few. Welcome to the coffee shop and you hear,
I didn't do it.
you're on a call, you walk in. First thing out of someone's mouth is,
Do you guys like donuts? By the way, how many people have you shot or killed?
you're walking along and you come across someone and say hi, and their reply is,
So, what's the worst thing you've ever seen?
or this,
Hey, Sergeant Be Safe. I remember you from school. Can you help me get out of this ticket?
or the comparison question.
You're cool, but what do you think about that other cop that pulled me over?
I'm Sergeant Be Safe, and I just want everyone to be safe.
Subscribe now.
And we're back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Thank you guys for tuning in. We have an amazing show ahead of us today. Most of you already know me who have transitioned from the Coach Clee page from Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Coach Clee in the lab. If you've transitioned over, you're aware of this. If not, if you're just now joining us, I want to thank you for tuning in. We're going to have a wonderful discussion. We talk about some deep and important topics here on Black and Blue. Welcome to the channel. This is a transition from the lab with Coach Clee on the Black and Blue. You guys see the website scrolling below. Take a gander at that. So many wonderful things and products and information is on that website. I'm Coach Clee. I'm your host. If many of you aren't aware of this, we've been live for about 3 years. We've transitioned over to this page. We are live now. I got a special guest in the back office. Some of you guys may know him. Some of you may not. But we're going to have a wonderful live today. His name is Byron Lewis, like you see right here in the title. And we're going to have a tremendous discussion. We're going to talk about so many wonderful things. He is retired state trooper. He's worked over 25 years in law enforcement. He's originally from Philadelphia. And if you ask him, he wasn't going to be a law enforcement officer or trooper originally. He wanted to be a cartoonist. And we can talk about that momentarily. But he's been in some wonderfully intense situations throughout the course of his career. And what's got him into this career, it led him to be of service. And we're going to discuss that. We're going to discuss disparities. We're going to discuss law enforcement and minority. Law enforcement with minorities. We're going to discuss both sides of the coin in law enforcement. So stay tuned. I'm going to bring him here momentarily.
Over and out.
Hello, this is Sergeant Be Safe, and I want to welcome all you viewers and our very special guest to Black and Blue. So get your questions ready and enjoy the show.
Film Pack.
Subscribe now.
Film Pack.
Byron, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing great. It's good to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you for making yourself available and coming through for this discussion on this live. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I joined in law enforcement back in 1983.
Okay.
I had not originally planned to be a police officer, but I had a baby on the way. I needed a job with some benefits. I was an assistant teacher at a special education school in Philadelphia. And while that was fun and rewarding, and my major was shifting from English to special education, Philadelphia School District would go on strike every 2 years or so. Couldn't do that with a baby coming. So it was either Philadelphia Police Department, Pennsylvania State Police, or the military. And to make the story short, the state police called first.
Okay.
And I've never looked back. I enjoyed my 25 plus years in the Pennsylvania State Police. I've worked a lot of different disciplines within the Pennsylvania State Police. And it got me out of Philadelphia, which is not a bad thing either. Not that Philly's a bad place. I enjoyed it. Philadelphia is a wonderful place to be from and to go and visit, but I can't make enough money to live there comfortably.
Gotcha.
I mean, it's the cost of living there is just too much. But I've gone from Philadelphia to Everett, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
If you don't know where Everett is, it's in Bedford County. It's about an hour, 20 minutes east of Pittsburgh, about 3 hours west of Philadelphia.
Okay.
When I got out of the car, I doubled the population of minorities in the county. And I finished my first year of probation at that station. I loved it. If it wasn't so far away from everything, I'd have stayed. But like I said, law enforcement was not where I was planning on going. But as they say, God always has His plans.
Exactly.
You can make yours, but He's going to make the changes.
Yeah.
I wanted to be an animator for Walt Disney. I was an art major in high school.
Okay.
Could draw. Not so much paint, because painting required a lot more money than pencils and paper. I came from a family, youngest of 8.
Oh, wow.
My oldest siblings, my oldest 2 siblings, I only knew them on holidays because there was 26 years between the oldest and me.
Oh, wow.
So they were already gone and out of the house and on their own lives. So I saw them occasionally, but not very. But the core six, I'll say, that I grew up with, 3 boys, 3 girls. The first 2 were 2 boys that went out and moved to New York and such. But I had both my parents. I had my brothers and sisters, and in Philadelphia, that was my own street gang. And I'll say it this way: we came from the projects, Richard Allen projects in North Philadelphia. We moved to Westbrook Lane. My dad was what you would refer to as a blockbuster.
Okay.
We were the first black family on the block when we moved there. Now, they tell me these stories because I was born while we had moved there. So I claim projects, but I never lived there.
I understand.
But we still have family and friends that were down there. We go all the time. But we moved. I grew up in West Oak Lane back in 1961 or so. Philadelphia decided they wanted to integrate the schools. So I was part of that busing program to take the black kids from one neighborhood and ship them to a predominantly white neighborhood to go to school. I will say this though, I think if the buses had went in both directions, our problems as a country would have been solved a lot sooner.
Interesting.
Because the buses only went in one direction. They took the black kids to the white neighborhoods, but never took the white kids to the black neighborhoods. Even though there wasn't that much, at the time, there wasn't that much differences, but it was, that's another story. It has not a whole lot to do with black and blue, except when it comes to being black in blue.
Right.
Okay. The thumbnail sketch of my career was patrol initially along the turnpike. They sent me to school to Northwestern University for a year for police staff and command. Okay. I was only the second minority in our department to go.
Okay.
At the time I had 4 years on the job. So it was kind of unprecedented for me to have been selected and for me to have attended. I came back, I did about 5 years in the Bureau of Research and Development. I worked as our assistant. Then it was called the Equal Employment Opportunity Office, as opposed to what others would call it, the Affirmative Action Office.
Okay.
That required us to be an auditor not only of our own agency and how we processed and handled minorities, but also whoever we did business with as the entity of the Pennsylvania State Police. They had to be non-discriminatory employers if we were supposed to do business with them. After that, I worked for our commissioner's office as I kind of remember that job title. It was the longest title I ever held. but if I put it in a nutshell, what I did was read, channel, and respond for the commissioner to anybody who inquired about activities of the Pennsylvania State Police.
Okay.
A correspondence coordinator is probably the closest thing to what I did.
Okay.
I also served for a little while with the Uniform Crime Reporting System, where I was responsible for the collection of data from throughout the state, criminal offenses, and helped ours. Yeah. Well, we helped transition while we were transitioning from UCR's Uniform Crime Reporting to the National Incident-Based Reporting System, otherwise known as NIBRS. Yeah. Both systems had their pluses and minuses, but the funniest minus of the UCR system is there was a year where Philadelphia had less violent crime than Harrisburg.
Oh, really? What year was that?
The year that they underreported. And I'm not trying to throw Philadelphia under the bus, but if you withhold your reporting long enough, it doesn't count for that calendar year.
Gotcha.
And during that time, Harrisburg had a higher incident of violent crime, rapes, murders, that kind of stuff. Philadelphia kind of withheld theirs until, I think it was January was the reporting month. So January or February. And then they shipped it in.
skewed
So,
the numbers.
yeah, they just held off this creative accounting.
It is, yeah. If you think
But I
about
say all that to say,
Hey, who is that? I see you there sneaking around.
Film
Oh
pack.
no,
What were you doing behind that building?
I was sneaking around.
Sneaking around, huh? What's your name? Haven't I seen you before?
My name is Bubba Bigfoot.
Do you mind taking your mask off? Aha! Just what I thought. I knew it was you, Chance Wilder. You shouldn't lie and give a fake name to the police. Now I'm gonna have to take you in.
I'm caught again.
I'm glad it wasn't me this time. It would
Film
have
pack.
been a bummer. You should always be honest, upfront, and courteous when dealing with the police. Otherwise, it causes all sorts of other problems. Wild Chance is back off to jail.
Film pack. Film pack.
Subscribe now.
my career allowed me to look at law enforcement from a whole lot of different facets. It wasn't just arresting people, even though that was part of what you're supposed to do as a police officer.
exactly.
And I always say law enforcement is more service industry than anything else. If you are not of the mindset to be of service with somebody, and for the most part in law enforcement, you're meeting folks at their worst incident.
Yeah.
You're meeting them when somebody broke into their house, they had a car accident, their child or relative got injured in a crash or was robbed, or you're meeting folks when they're not at their best.
Exactly.
And unfortunately, not everybody comes into law enforcement with that service mentality. And that's one of the reasons why I kind of want to advocate for the law enforcement community, in that you can't change anything from the outside. It's incumbent upon minorities, it's incumbent upon women, it's incumbent upon those who view themselves as outside to become inside to affect the changes that needed to happen. I think I spoke to you earlier about there was a time where there were few, if non-existent, minorities within the Pennsylvania State Police. That didn't change until there was a class action suit filed against the department to require them to hire minorities.
Right.
All of that kind of came in, gelled around 1972, and the first fully committed hiring of minorities in the Pennsylvania State Police was in 1975.
Right.
Now, at the time, Pennsylvania was the second largest law enforcement agency in the country. We were probably the largest full service, because California had more people, but California is broken up into Highway Patrol, which is patrol only, and then they had their criminal investigation division. I feel like I'm talking a lot, but there's so much that needs to get out.
Good information. I understand.
Had it not been for the Bolden consent decree, which is the lawsuit filed in the Pennsylvania State Police, minorities may not have had the opportunities that they had. In fact, once the court order was entered, the commissioner at that time refused to hire in order to avoid complying with the consent decree. The co-plaintiff, the co-defendant in that lawsuit was the Fraternal Order of Police, if you can believe that.
Wow.
So the same people that once you got on the job were supposed to be your representatives for collective bargaining, were also those who were working hard to make sure you didn't get on. Needless to say, tensions between minorities and non-minorities in the Pennsylvania State Police has not been great. It has gotten better, but but it hasn't been great. And there's a long road that it needs to go. And that's just not Pennsylvania. That's Philadelphia. That's any law enforcement agency with a diverse population that they serve, not necessarily that is within the agency, needs to come to grips with that.
Right. Understandably so. And we're going to dive deep into most of the topics that you've covered here. I just want to ask a few questions, just to kind of give a little background. It's interesting that you said you became you joined the state police because you needed the benefits, you needed a good paying job, you were having a child on the way. Speaking of the child or children, period, how did kids or your own children, how did they view you as actually working in the field, and how do they view you now as a law enforcement retiree?
My youngest daughter enjoyed the uniform. I'll say that. She didn't like the absences.
Right.
At that time, that was my first marriage. My family lived in Philadelphia, and I lived in Bedford County.
Wow.
Because it was difficult for then children and women in a county where there were maybe a dozen Black folks. I don't know how I statute of limitations is expired, so I can share this story.
Okay.
My oldest girl was in school bus, and there was a kid that would call her out her name on the bus. And one day I decided I was going to address that, so I pulled the school bus over in uniform with the hat on, campaign hat, the brim, in the face of that young man that wanted to call her a colorful name. And I explained to him they may never find the body.
Wow.
Now, the reason why I share that story is one has to understand how devastating racial disparities can be when it comes to not only children, because that affected her, and it affected me, but it affected me enough that I didn't mind losing my job behind it.
Right.
Needless to say, I did get into some administrative hot water, but my daughter never had that problem with that young man anymore. And then the next year, they moved back to Philadelphia, and I stayed to finish out my probationary period.
Right.
But that absence and the way our schedules worked made it difficult for my family. We law enforcement, you don't have weekends, you have days off, and that might happen anytime. Sometimes those days off may not necessarily be consecutive. You might have a Tuesday and be off again the next Friday. And for us in our agency, we worked what they call triples. You're on 3 o'clock in the afternoon, get off at 11 o'clock in the evening. You start again the next day at 7 o'clock in the morning, get off at 3. And then at 11 o'clock that night of that same day, you do another 7. So those triple headers, while they condensed your work week, it was brutal on the body and your family. So when I had my days off, be it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, whatever day it was, when I came back to Philadelphia where my family was, those were days my kids had off too. Schools didn't always understand that. But it was important. It is important to make connections, to let my girls know that they're still important, that dad's still here. And I think that kind of offset some of the other demands. And I guess now that I think about it, the concessions to your employment are things to consider when it comes to law enforcement. You have to make adjustments. You have to make ways to make your family know that they're still your family, they're important. So the long and short of it, they liked it as kids. None of them decided to continue in my footsteps. They decided they didn't want to be in law enforcement.
Right.
My youngest girl has a pharmaceutical. She's in a pharmaceutical sales company, she's making more money than I can think about. My second marriage, my son and daughter are, one's a professor in a college in Kentucky, facing similar challenges that my youngest daughter did in Everett, but a different, because now she's the professional rather than a parent. My son is an entrepreneur. He has his own business here in Harrisburg.
Okay.
I can give him a shameless plug unless you let me.
Absolutely.
Noise gate car audio on Paxman Street in front. He does all kinds of stuff, but he's what I call an electronic savant. My grandson says my daddy can fix anything. And I believe he's correct. He does. He can. I didn't get that gene. Of all the talents my mom and dad could have given to me, I got handsome. I didn't get handy.
No, I'm kidding. I understand.
I stole that from my wife. I didn't come up with that.
Okay. I can't argue with that one then. I can't. The reason why I got to throw my shot back, ladies and gentlemen, because before we got on screen, he threw a couple shots about some football teams that are irrelevant right now. There's only one relevant team, but we're not going to discuss that. That's another conversation for another time.
Okay. Just as long as you sent them the thank you card, that's all I wanted to make sure you did.
And moving on, but you were talking about parents and being a parent. What kind of who influenced you early on in your career? Did you have family? Did you have mentors? Did someone take you under their wing and kind of guide you to keep you on the straight and narrow, or as opposed to going right or left during the earlier or throughout your career period?
Well, before I got into law enforcement, like I said, I was the youngest of 8. So we had our own street gang in Philadelphia, and street gangs in Philadelphia were serious things. But because there were so many of us, and because of the way my parents were, we were not the kids to mess with.
Gotcha.
So I wasn't even though I was just as vulnerable, I wasn't as susceptible to the influences of street gangs in Philly. But my mentors were my mom and dad first. I cannot remember my father working less than 2 jobs. I also cannot remember my mom not working, although my older siblings did. But they both strived and stressed education. We were referred to as the Cinderella Lewises because we all had to be home by midnight, no matter what we were doing.
Yeah, that pumpkin reared its head.
Yeah, well, and there were things about my childhood that when I talked to other folks, they didn't experience quite the same thing. I guess my parents had to have a structure with that many children at that time. Come on, think about it. 6 kids in a 3-bedroom row home in Philadelphia.
Yeah. 1
bathroom. If there's not some organization the thing will go haywire. Yeah. And if there's not some structure. But I'll say this, living in that environment and in that street, because the whole neighborhood was our family. You couldn't act up in the street, you'd have got 2 spankings. 3, actually. The parent or adult that saw you out in the street acting stupid, they'd wear you behind out and they'd take you home. And the parent that was home would wear you behind out. And then the one who was at work and came in later. So anytime you acted out, you had a 3 for it. So you learned early on, behave yourself when you're out in the street.
Right.
Now I had a high school teacher, Mr. Grossman. I'll never forget him. He was my English teacher. And he gave me, imparted to me the love of words and language. And throughout my high school, which only high school in Philadelphia, was extremely diverse in its complement of students as well as teachers. So I got to experience all kinds of cultures. I guess the biggest thing for my parents' life, my family life, was there's nobody that God made that's any better than you. And God didn't make you any better than anybody else. And I guess that's carried on through me. So, and that was similar to some of the training I received in the state police.
Okay.
You treat everybody you encounter with the same dignity and respect that you would give to your mother or father, sister or brother, grandfather or grandmother, until their behavior dictated otherwise. Now, I'm gonna go off on a tangent here, but there's a lot of folks that have different views about some of the video stuff that goes on about law enforcement, and especially those that resulted in death of Black men and women.
Right.
And I'll say this because no matter how much video you get, you don't get all the story.
Absolutely.
But there are those that you work with that their ego is always on the outside. They never approach a situation from an active service. So that sometimes escalates things. And will I say that every death by law enforcement against a minority, male or female, is wrong? No. But I cannot say all of them were right either. It's important to take yourself out of the equation. I can't tell you how many times I've been called out of my name. In law enforcement.
Yeah.
But if I felt personally about it and acted on what I reacted personally, then I'm not doing my job. My job is not about how I felt about what you said. My job is about whether what you just did is or is not a crime.
Right.
I don't know that everybody I worked with viewed it in the same ways. And some of the incidences that you've seen on the media in the recent years, I don't think they viewed it in the same way either. So I'll get off the soapbox, but suffice it to say, if you want to make sure that there is fairness and safety in dealing with law enforcement by all communities, not just Blacks or Hispanics, then it'd probably be a good idea for you to understand what they can do and what you can do.
Right.
And not everybody knows that.
Right. Yep. And I know, and we talked on the phone beforehand a couple of weeks ago, and I know we talked backstage as well. It's important to have the service mentality. It's important to, I believe, this is my own opinion, to strive to make a difference in the community, a positive difference. You were talking about, I don't have it verbatim, but image is everything. On how you were saying, you didn't see your first male teacher until high school, or have a certain role model in that perception or in that view of yours until a certain age, and being a law enforcement officer in a minority is a very important role, and having that mentality of service and having that mentality of wanting to make a difference. What kind of disparities did you see while you were working on both sides of the blue line, while working and with the citizens in the community as well?
Well, I'll give you a couple of examples to kind of illustrate my view. I was working alongside men and women on a skirmish line in York County.
Okay.
The Ku Klux Klan was having a rally and a march.
Okay.
And the community at large and a group of, I'll say, outside agitators wanted to counter protest what the Ku Klux Klan had gotten their permit for. And our job was to make sure that everybody stayed on their side of whatever line there was. So I'm getting conversations from the Klan members of one thing. And then I'm getting conversations from the folks, some of whom look like me. That's another viewpoint. And I guess that goes back to what I was saying earlier about taking things personal. I can't take personal the names that I was called by a Klan member, just like I can't take personal the names that I was called by the person behind me, because the names aren't crimes.
Right.
You pick up something and throw at something or strike somebody, that's another issue. But as long as it's verbal, that's not a crime. And for that period of time, during those two, because there was two different rallies, not the same day. Those two rallies, there were arrests made on both sides, but there was nobody that complained about the excessive force on either side. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that to say that the Pennsylvania State Police is fantastic. Because
Right.
we're
Understand.
but it speaks to the need to make sure in law enforcement that you're not adding to the problem. Your job is to make sure it stays as low as possible. What we used to train as you use the least amount of force necessary to effect the arrest.
Right.
So the first option isn't always the handgun. Okay, now let me go on the other side. There are those, and I got to say this, and even though a lot of our folks may not like to hear it, there are those people of color who automatically look at a uniform and make a judgment.
Yeah.
Just as easily as folks looking at a skin color will make a judgment, and both can be just as wrong as rain.
Right.
Most of the folks I work with, black, white, male, female, Hispanic, Asian, were hired to be of service to the folks that they took the uniform on to serve. I mean, there's very few jobs, there's very few professions, because I can't call it a job. There's very few professions where you have the authority to remove the rights of a person from them. But there's also very few jobs that you can make sure that a person who's gone through something dramatic or terrible can come out okay. I mean, you can be a doctor. I don't have the discipline, but you can be a doctor and perhaps do the same thing. But I think as law enforcement gets a short shrift when it comes to public perception, because folks grow up on, I mean, for me, it was Dragnet. Gives you an idea how old I am. For folks nowadays, it's NCIS and Law and Order. And if you ever really take a look at both of those shows, the one that's the corniest, which is Dragnet, was a little bit more realistic of what law enforcement is. You investigate the crime, you try to make the determination who's the guilty party or who is guilty as much as you can, and leave the prosecution to somebody else. I'm not concerned about whether you get off or not. My job is to make sure I have enough evidence to make the arrest. That's not the way the public perceives us. They think somebody broken in a house, NCIS is coming in there with 5,000 texts to dust everything for fingerprints, and they're going to run DNA, and everything's going to happen in a half an hour. And that's not realistic.
Right. Absolutely.
So when you have unrealistic expectations that it's impossible for the rank and file law enforcement officer to meet, there's a lot of, I won't say just disappointment, but a lot of disdain for what is perceived as inadequate service when it's really not. Your expectations are
astronomical.
Through the roof. Not unrealistic expectations.
Certain be safe, and I'm here on patrol. And I just learned we had some unsavory characters come into town. Stay tuned, and I'll show you how to protect yourself from their wicked ways.
Ooh, I think I'm gonna like this city. Rob you blind here, and I'm here to cause total chaos.
Chance Wilder here, and I just snuck in town too. I'm here to scam you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I don't want you to have any interactions with these fiendish foes. So lock your doors around Rob You Blind, and don't fall for the scam from Chance Wilder, or should I say, Wild Chance.
Subscribe now.
Thank you for clearing that up. Absolutely, you're absolutely correct. I know the shows that of the age that I remember watching were definitely NCIS during when it was coming into existence, and Cops. The show and I used to be a big fan of the show Cops, and watching that and watching those shows, especially Cops, you see what's kind of made for the TV. For you need a certain level of entertainment and shock value. You see how it's clipped and cut down to certain events and all, and so you get a kind of a skewed view on what's actually happening, even though it's considered live and happening in person.
Right.
It's not to throw any shade to any of the shows or anything. It's not actually 100% accurate. And I know we were talking also with our job, you can get 30 seconds of pure adrenaline, 30 seconds of pure excitement for an incident that's happened, and have an entire shift of boredom. Or getting caught up on paperwork. I know, not to go off on a tangent, I got into this profession. For one, my father was a police officer. For two, I wanted to experience different things every single day. And for three, I did not want to do a bunch of paperwork. Little did I know at the time that that's basically what this job is.
Yes, it is. Well, although now it's not necessarily paper, it's electronic submission.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to touch on is my background, especially when I was at Northwestern in research and statistics. One of the problems of research is that when you start your study, your presence sometimes changes the outcome. Let me give you an example. Our department wanted to put in-camera cars back in patrol cars back in, I guess, maybe 90, 92.
Okay.
Now, for the state police, 4,900 member agency, it's no simple task to outfit all those vehicles. So they had to be sure about how to do it and what's the right way. That was one of the projects I worked on. When we did a target where we put a pilot program where there was one station in one troop and one station in another troop that had the cameras installed, the resistance by the officers was dramatic. They didn't want, quote, Big Brother watching them. Every time you flipped the siren or the lights on, the camera would activate, and it would back record a minute before. It's always running, but it would never save until you hit the switch.
Right.
Once those pilots went through and we got the data back, of those complaints of misconduct on the officers, 93%, 97% of those that came back were found to be untrue because of the evidence in the video camera. So after the initial pilot, folks then said, okay, well, maybe it's not such a bad thing to have the camera in the cars. Fast forward to 2020, 2019, 2018, folks are talking about body cameras on police officers. Does it change the police officer's behavior? It probably does. Does it change a public's behavior if they know that the cameras are there? It might. The best thing that can happen in those confrontations is that whatever level of volatility it's on, once the police officer arrives, it should decrease, not increase. And if the camera helps it decrease, I'm all for cameras.
Right.
However, they ain't cheap. And you figure the majority of the departments across the country are average between 5 and 25 people actually on patrol.
Right.
Majority, not all. I mean, but you have your Philadelphia's, your New York's, your Pittsburgh's, your Los Angeles. You have your big Chicago and others. But by and large, more, even if you look around central Pennsylvania, you don't have too many 600-700 man departments. You just don't. So that's a big financial hit if you want to do that. Do I think it's required? I'd lean towards yes. But because it's required, in my mind, then it has to come from some kind of funding from our governmental agencies that approve the budgets for law enforcement. If you want to have cameras, you got to pay for them.
Exactly.
And I think having cameras, by and large, will help decrease those incidences, or at least help you prosecute and identify the police officers that don't view this as a service industry, as well as provide enough evidence to exonerate those officers that are being falsely accused by the public.
I like that. And it's interesting that you say one of the topics that was in a poll, and of course has been a topic throughout the nation, is kind of you don't hear it as much, but you heard it during the height of COVID, was defund the police, 100%. And so coming from a feeling standpoint, or wherever, I can't speak for someone else, so I don't want to put words out there that aren't mine. But just from wherever it was coming from, whatever the feelings or the logic was behind it, you got to make it make sense. The cameras, body worn cameras, BWCs, are actively used in the field now. I know I use them. It's required. It's in our policy. We use them. So therefore, like you said, it's not cheap. So departments that are maybe struggling, departments that or just weren't anticipating taking that financial hit until the world kind of changed dramatically in a short amount of time, there is a financial component where you can't say defund certain things, but yes, you want everything recorded and saved as well. You got to find that common medium and find that common balance between it. And I know, like you stated before, anything new is, I think with any occupation, change is not always wanted with any occupation, but sometimes that change is necessary. You were stating about cameras and vehicles. I know with body worn cameras, it was like, oh man, they're just going to monitor us all day long, and it's going to be, they're going to be all in our, if we have our cell phone and we're making a phone call, it's going to be on the body worn camera, and so many different things were going through our heads. But I do believe, from my experience in court, prosecutions, or just internal investigations, it saved a lot of officers as well, because certain things were said by another person. Someone would come in and file a complaint that a situation went one way, and then if you go back and view the camera itself, it's video documented that it did not go that way, right, and that the officer was actually accurate in his statement and didn't even know that a complaint could have potentially been filed against them and filed falsely.
Right. And that's why I think it's important that it happens. But let me spend a little bit of time on that phrase, defund the police. Because it never was clearly defined by either the media or the folks that were screaming it.
I agree. Yeah.
My department, state police, used to have a scuba unit, 4 of them throughout the state, that would go whenever there was a crime or they believed evidence or a body was underwater. That component would go out and recover the evidence. That maintaining those 4 units with the equipment that's required and the overtime that would necessarily come in, because we got a big state. Our department had to do a study to determine how valuable that is. Now, put on the back shelf for a second. You are not using law enforcement to gather evidence in a place only because it's underwater. Okay? You gotta put that on the shelf for a second, because we never would consider anybody other than law enforcement to gather evidence. But it was cost prohibitive. So the funds that went for that component of our organization got rescinded. We decided to disband that, and they contracted with other departments as well as local dive companies to do that evidence collecting. So in a way, you could say our scuba team was defunded, but that those resources were applied in other areas. Right. So if they're talking defunding, meaning that no longer there exists a police budget, now that's crazy. But if you're talking some of the things that are not police functions, like we got rid of the Pennsylvania State Police. You weren't able to get a driver's license if you weren't sitting in the car with a trooper to pass your test. That existed. In order for you to get a driver's license, you had to be at a state police testing site. Well, that too has a cost component. And it turned out that it seemed more beneficial for our budget as well as to the public. And there's arguments on both sides of this, where your high school driver's ed and your private driver's training companies could give you the skill set to pass the test. In a way, that component was defunded. Now, there's arguments. The police have a vested interest in a well-trained driver. A school driver's ed instructor might have an investment in passing more students.
Right.
Okay. As a police officer, I could care less whether you came 5 times and failed 5 times. As a driver's ed instructor, that might be a factor. So there's an argument on both sides of that, but is that driver's test a purely police function? No, it could be argued that it couldn't be, or you could have better allocation of your resources. So to me, the term defunding the police, as long as you're not taking it in the context of removing the entire budget for law enforcement,
right?
I can understand the concept because it happens all the time. We always reallocate funds in order to meet the needs that we have. Everybody needs cars every year. Every agency needs cars. How you go about getting the funding to buy the cars and equip them, decal them, how you decide what kind of weaponry or cage or what have you, that fund has to come from someplace. So the term defund the police, if you're talking about abolishing a police department, that's just how Mike Tyson said, that's ludicrous. But if you're talking about taking a very objective view of how are you spending your money as an agency, I don't have a problem with that. Because is there some things we need to do? Yes. Are there some things that could be better done by somebody else? Yes.
Absolutely,
yeah. But does that mean every time you turn around, the police are going to say, no, we're not coming, that's mental health, or no, we're not coming, that's the game warden? No. If you call 911, you expect a police officer to respond. Now, it might get channeled someplace else, but unless and until there's other emergency numbers to get specific services, 911, unfortunately, is going to be the catch-all, and a police officer is going to have to come.
Absolutely. And I will say, speaking of calling 911 and it be a mental health call or the game commission call or anything like that, is very funny that you say, because during the change of the world, it's for lack of a better term, I know law enforcement per se has been taking a great deal of effort in training officers in mental health recognition and how to apply this training as well, to the point now that most departments here locally have mental health co-responders riding with us. So that way, if a situation is out of control or has the potential where crisis intervention would need to be notified, we have a co-responder right there on the scene. And not only that, officers are trained to recognize certain signs of, okay, you don't want to typecast a certain situation or person,
right?
Where you're thinking, okay, a crime has occurred. This is it. This is end all be all. What I say is the law, as opposed to, okay, yes, a potential crime had occurred. Why did this occur? This person's thinking this way. This person has a history of mental illnesses. Bam. Okay, well, instead of going this way, let's go this way with it.
Right.
And totally
and that's important. In fact, in my last position before I retired was our early intervention program director. What is that? That is whenever there was a police officer that was found to have misconduct of some kind, not serious kind, but to try to figure out a way rather than discipline, because let me go back to the dollars and cents of it. It cost back in the when I was still working about $196,000 per trooper from application to patrol.
Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Do the math, 4,900 officers. That's a lot of money. And that's a lot of investment to fire somebody because they made a stupid mistake. My job was to try to figure out what was their issue and channel the correct resources, be it Gamblers Anonymous or Alcoholism Anonymous or any other external resource that could salvage this person's career. Not necessarily in lieu of discipline, but in addition to discipline to try to retain that person. Because you don't want to lose the investment of a 7-8 year trooper that doesn't know how to budget their money or develops a drinking problem on the job and hasn't figured out a way to get help. My job was to find out what that was and get them the help that they needed. I'm glad to say for the duration of my position, and I inherited that office, which was relatively new when I got there. Most of the folks that crossed my desk retained their employment and went on and had great careers. One of the other functions of that job was the development of what I'll call, well, not that I called it, it was named that, the contact data report, where the department was doing a self-assessment on how they interacted with people during patrol encounters. Again, like with the cameras, the guys on patrol were unhappy about another piece of paper they had to complete. But what that data gave us was how often folks were stopped, how often folks were searched or requested to be searched, and how that correlated to the perceived race of the person that was being stopped. And it turned out that our department, while it didn't find more contraband, and when I say contraband, guns, weapons, things that they shouldn't have, they didn't find more in minority operated vehicles. They in fact found more in non-minority operated vehicles, but they asked minorities more frequently, can I search your car? Which became now a training component. Why? What are the things, what are the criteria as the officer on the road that you check off in your brain? This is a person I need to ask to search their car. And this is a person I don't need to ask to search their car. During my time on the road, during my time in the state police, I'll say it that way because it wasn't my seizure. The largest single seizure we had was a RV off the turnpike at 283.
Okay.
Had tons of, no, not tons, had several hundred pounds of marijuana, several less than 100 pounds of cocaine in an RV. Nice RV. But the guy that stopped it, the people that were operating it, and the questions that were asked during the traffic stop led them to believe, okay, I need to take this further. So I guess the reason why I bring this all up is that it becomes a training issue. What criteria are you using besides race to make those decisions on this is the person I need to search or this is the person I don't need to search? Because the bottom line is the traffic stops, it's virtually impossible, contrary to popular opinion, to determine a person's race when they drive by. And if you're on the highway at watching the vehicles go by at 65 miles an hour with a radar gun, unless you're doing, and I'm not trying to throw New Jersey or any other agency under the bus, but there were those who would sit perpendicular to the highway to watch traffic rather than enforce the traffic laws, and then make the decision to go make the stop based on what they saw. Okay, that existed. We don't have to sugarcoat it. It existed, but we learned from it.
Right.
The bottom line, though, is 90%, and this is just me throwing out a number, not necessarily an actual statistic, but the majority of the folks that get stopped for traffic violation that are speeding or otherwise, you don't, as a police officer, you don't know the race of that person until you get up in the car.
Until you get to the car, yeah.
And how you deal with that person comes back to where you trained and what's your mindset about your position.
Right.
I had a funny story. I had a traffic stop where I stopped a person who English was his second language.
Okay.
And he didn't master it well. His wife, English was not a language she understood at all.
Mm-hmm.
He was getting cited for speeding. His wife thought I was doing something different, and she smacked my pinch pad that had the citation out of my hand. Okay? Now, if this was in the 2000s, that might have been enough to get her arrested. If she swung at me again, get her shot, tased, what have you. Mm-hmm. But because, like I said, this was not her first language, and I knew that based on my conversation with her husband. Yeah, I didn't want to bend down and pick up all my stuff, but I did. Mm-hmm. Yeah, she got cited for disorderly conduct. She didn't want it, but she did. And he still got cited for his speeding violation, whatever else. I can't remember what else it was. Mm-hmm. But because, like I said, if you don't take an action personally and use the totality of circumstances, right? Did it warrant me slapping her in cuffs and putting her in the back of patrol car? No. She didn't understand what was going on. Mm-hmm. And my ego was not such that just because you smacked the pad out of my hand, I'm going to get upset.
Right.
Now, if you had struck me, that's a whole nother
That's
issue.
a different, it's
a different ball game. But I say all that to say, it is important not only that there are folks with cool heads with a service mentality when it comes to law enforcement, but it's important to have more folks that look like the public that they're serving to be in law enforcement. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that here momentarily. I just want to go back and say, as you were saying, while running speed, you have the radar gun right there. You can't see the person, what nationality or race the person is that's going by in that speeding vehicle. We don't have the radar gun here, municipal. We have the Robic, the stopwatch. So it makes it that much more difficult as well, right? Because you got to get the first line, then you got to get the second line. For those of you that don't know how, that's a quick run on how aerobic works when you're running speed. So by the time you see the car and you get the speed and go after it, you really don't know. You really don't.
You don't. And Lord help you if it's aerially observed violations. When we had the plane or a helicopter up doing speed enforcement, they're just calling it out to you. You have no idea. You're finding the silver Chrysler that went by. They've seen it from the aircraft, but you don't know who's driving that car. Neither did they until you stop it.
Yep.
So, but does that mean that there's no such thing as racial profiling? Not in the sense of traffic stops by themselves. No. Right. However, are there those who go looking for certain demographics to stop? There are some that are like that. Mm-hmm. We may not want to admit that as law enforcement, but we've worked with folks that have a propensity to stop a certain group and not stop another group. Mm-hmm. And it's incumbent upon us in law enforcement to call them on.
Right.
And I think the silence of law enforcement in those instances, while it's not as silent as it had been, has gotten broader, and that contributes some to the areas of improvement that we've seen thus far.
Gotcha. But
again, it's nowhere near as much. But think about it the same way. When's the last time you heard a doctor say that another doctor did a bad procedure? That doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. Should it? I'm of the opinion that it should. However, in our litigious society, that's not something that happens frequently.
It's common practice, right?
Yeah. It's not. You'd be hard pressed to successfully sue a physician for a mistake that they may have made, even though there's never been a physician or police officer or anybody that has been perfect in everything they've done. Mm-hmm. To a greater or lesser degree, you may have some errors. You might have some procedural errors, or I've issued citations and forgot to get the person to sign it.
Yeah.
Or I thought it was this car, but it was actually that car. You're not infallible. And
put the wrong date on the station, working a night shift.
Right. So do mistakes happen? Yes, but should a mistake in law enforcement cost somebody their life? No. Should a mistake for a physician cost somebody their life? No. And when it does happen, you got to try to do what you can to fix it,
Right.
as best you can.
So let me ask you this: what in the line of working throughout your career? I'm going to ask you. It's a two-part question, but the first part: what do you think frustrates you? Is still frustrating, or frustrates you the most about the law enforcement career itself?
For the smaller agencies that I'm familiar with, upward advancement is a challenge.
Okay.
Because you may have the potential or have several people of that recent hires, I'll put it that way, that have the aptitude but not the opportunity to advance because your incumbents are there and they're not going to go until they retire.
Right.
However, and that's one of the benefits of being in a larger organization, there are so many different specialties that you don't have to always be in one discipline your entire career unless that's what you choose. In our department, I say our like you're still there, but in the state police, there were over 50 different specialties, some full-time, some part-time, that you could do. If you didn't like what you were doing, you could try to be a garage inspector. You can try to be a motor carrier safety inspector. You could try for what most folks call as detective, but it was our criminal investigation division. You can be a firearms instructor. You can be a trainer at the academy, and we had the main academy in Hershey and 4 regional academies. So there are many facets that you can try for. Research and development was something I got into. Even our human resources to help construct and validate the entry criteria, to help develop the test for folks to come to establish what is and what is not important. It's just, that's the biggest, in my mind, the biggest hurdle, frustration for those in a smaller agency is that you might have more expertise. You might even have more aptitude for a position, but you can't get there until the vacancy happens.
Right.
The other frustrating part of it is from the administrative part. If you're the station commander, if you're the supervisor administrator, there are things you want to do that you just don't have the funding to do. I'll give you an example. Most of our the majority of our seizures for drugs did not come about through investigative work. It came about through traffic stops. If you added up all the quantities of contraband that was seized, the majority of that came from guys doing the patrol function, seeing something that's not quite right with the car or the traffic violation, and taking it a step further, boom, you found the drugs. Now, that's not to say that our drug task force and such were ineffective. It's just that's a lot of money, a lot of time to put forth for not as much bang for your buck as the phrase goes. And unfortunately, we didn't spend as much, I don't think, we meaning law enforcement, not me, we meaning the state police, we didn't spend enough time up the chain. We spent more time at the grassroots level.
Right.
And that gets me to another frustration.
What's that?
There was a program called Weed and Seed.
Okay.
Where the federal government would toss money at different departments, and you would create what New York had referred to as the broken window mentality. Everything that was a violation got cited. Everything that was jaywalking, anything got somebody arrested, or the proprietor or whatever got criminal charges. And that's good because it does create a better environment for the folks that are there. But what it also does, especially in minority communities like Harrisburg or others, if that's where you go with your enforcement, those are the populations you're going to give a criminal record to, which means that is now a pool of applicants that you no longer have access to. Because if they have a criminal record or a bad taste of how law enforcement perceives them, they're not going to be the minority that applies for the police department. They're going to be the ones who run away from the police department.
Exactly, yeah.
And as much as me may not like to admit it, the change within law enforcement is going to come from those who look more like the police, the people that they are being policing. I don't care what race, if a department is predominantly or all black in a white community, it'll have the same obstacles that a department is all white in a black community would have. Because the perception, whether it's there or not, is that you're going to treat me differently because I'm not like you.
Right.
So in order to address that, we've got to get more diversity in the agencies, and we've got to get more diversity of thought in our agencies. Because there are those who believe that there's never been. In fact, I was looking before we spoke. I was looking up in the Police Executive Research Forum on how law enforcement perceives some of the things that have happened, like the George Floyds and Breonna Taylors. And 72% of and these are specific statistics, I'm not just bringing this one out of the top of my head, 70% of white officers believe that those kind of incidents were isolated, while 57% of black officers did not think they were isolated, that they were signs of a deeper problem. Then let that bake for a little while.
Yeah.
If the majority of your agency doesn't think that there's a problem, will they do anything to address it?
No, not if they don't think there's a problem at all. Absolutely not.
So, and while I won't say either one of those are 100% correct, there's a middle ground in there somewhere, and we've got to start looking at that. Now, are you going to go to Ottumwa, Iowa, and get a diverse department when because they're not there? But the same mentality of how you treat people with dignity and respect until their behavior dictates otherwise has to be part of your training, has to be baked in.
Should be standard across the board, yeah.
Right. And unfortunately, it needs to be part of the entry requirements for you to come in. The background investigations that were done on officers in some agencies are directly proportional to the amount of money that they have in order to do that. The Pennsylvania State Police, because of its size and its economic clout, was able to conduct background investigations relatively in-house, but relatively well. But if you're a 12-person department, what person are you going to pull off of your patrol to do the investigations on your applications and still have the same workload? Those are the frustrations that can crush a small agency. And I won't name any agencies specifically, but if you know of a 12, 15, 18-person department and expecting them to act as a agency like the state police or Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, that just can't happen. And those entry criterion have got to be re-examined.
Right.
Also, the enforcement, the enforcement officers hopping from agency to agency is another thing that needs to get addressed. How much? I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I know lateral movements have started to become more of a thing, at least, and that I've seen recently. I haven't seen that before, and within the past maybe 5 years or so, maybe even 5 to 7 years. But before then, I don't think maybe I didn't see it at all, or maybe I didn't know what the signs were, but I don't think I saw it at all. Honestly.
No, most that I believe that's. This is Byron Lewis talking, no statistical basis of fact, just my opinion. The demographics of our youth are younger folks than me, younger folks maybe even than you, don't look at jobs the way our parents looked at them. My dad worked for Bud Company for 20 some years. Now, granted, that was not his only job, but but the person that looks at a job and say, I'm going to be here for the next 25 years to collect a pension, that's not the way most folks look at it nowadays. So I understand the lateral movement, but the core criteria, the baseline for entry from one jurisdiction to another agency has to be the same. Some uniformity has to take place.
Right.
In my mind.
I agree. When I first started off, I worked for a 3-man department, so I know that was a struggle. 3-man and 2 part-timers, and part-timers were at will, basically. If they could fill in, they did. If not, then you're putting the puzzle together every single shift. And then the call volume wasn't astronomical, but it was still enough where you were busy throughout the shift. And then to add on top of that, where you had to do other in-house things, it just became chaotic, honestly.
Right. And it is, most people, most of the general public has no real concept of what it takes to run a law enforcement organization. It is, it's not just the cars with the lights and the sirens and the shotguns. It's more than that. How do you get your paper? How do you get your pens? Who takes care of your Wi-Fi? Who makes sure your Wi-Fi is secure? How often can you access your Wi-Fi depending on where you are in your patrol area? Your vehicle sometimes may not make the right connection. How do you determine what your radio system is going to be? And the things that when I came on the state police, we had on the turnpike, we had a radio that had 2 channels, and the channels changed depending on where you were along the turnpike. So
I believe that.
Somebody on the other channel, and it would have to be something very dramatic to allow the comm center in Highspire to flip the switch so Philadelphia could talk to Pittsburgh. Okay. Nowadays, that's not quite so difficult. But before, but to make that transition to where we are nowadays, that takes a lot more effort, not just financial, but mental. And you've got to sell it for the locals. You have to sell it to your local municipality. For the state, you had to get the governor to buy into it. And that part of the law enforcement thing, folks don't understand. I'd hate to be a small agency police chief nowadays. A friend of mine left the state police and became a police commissioner, superintendent, director. I don't know what they call them. And I looked at him and said, "Man, I love you, but I've never done that." But he is good at it. He thrives on it, and he's of the same mindset that I want to make this agency that now I'm the superintendent of or chief of to be as service oriented as I was when I was with the state police. So for that, I applaud him. I wouldn't do it, but I'm glad there's someone who wants to.
Wants to do it, exactly.
And he's the one that a kid in that county or township, and I'm not going to name him, can see and say, okay, if he can do that, I can do that. If it wasn't for an Althea Gibson or Arthur Ashe, we'd have never had the Williams sisters.
You're right.
So representation matters. You got to see it. And we have to be conscious about that in the law enforcement community. Not everybody needs to. It's not like you can say, okay, I need 1 Hispanic, I need 2 women, I need 15 blacks. It doesn't work like that. But you have to change your mindset to I have to make sure that my criteria takes into account those factors, and I get the best blend possible.
The melting pot of a diverse community.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And unfortunately, like I said, when our agency was being sued to try to do that, the perception was anybody that came in under the new criteria was less qualified than those that preceded them.
Right.
Which was odd because there were folks that, there were some minority candidates throughout the state police history that were, stars. They take a test, work the field, work the road, and they were just head and shoulders above everybody else. But it wasn't because they were a minority, it was because that's who they were.
Right.
But the perception was, aha, you were the minority that didn't deserve to get this job.
Yeah.
You're when they assigned you 1 for 1, that stopped my buddy or my brother or my sister from getting on the job. And that really was not the case. And I would assume that happened in both smaller agencies and in the city agencies the same.
I can imagine that as well. Let me ask you. We talked about frustrations. Let's take the exact opposite of that question. What are some of the things that you hold near and dear and are very proud? Some fond moments throughout your career.
Well, there's a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
A lot more of them when you stop and think about it. That when you're working, you don't see it. Mm-hmm. But now that I can look back, there were tons of. I guess the most rewarding thing I had happen to me while I was working was the delivery of a baby along the side of the road.
Oh wow! Okay.
Let me rephrase that. I was present at the delivery along the side of the road. Dad did most of the work.
Okay.
But I supplied the blankets and the water and such, so that until the EMTs came, mama and baby came out on fire. And that's stood with me for a while.
It's a proud moment. Yeah. You should brag on that.
Yeah. Our Camp Cadet program is another one. We used to, and I believe they still do, select kids from the areas to go to a camp where they get exposed to the true side of law enforcement and not what they see on television.
Right.
And that has become, when I was involved with that, and granted, I wasn't directly involved all day, every day for each one, but the times where I did get a chance to participate, it was amazing to me watching the children light up. How much, even though you think kids don't want structure, they do.
Mm-hmm.
How you look at the kid when they're walking in the first day and you think they're not going to know they're not going to even want to be making up a bed. But before it's all said and done, they're making beds you can bounce a quarter off of. They're standing to and saluting and marching, but they're also getting exposed to, not every time do I see a police officer as somebody for me to be frightened of. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, there's not as much minority participation as there should be, mm-hmm. to kind of override their perception from the streets.
Yeah, that's a good learning experience for a juvenile to go through.
Yeah, well, and there's studies that show that that's what some agencies are changing. If you look at the IACP or PERF, Police Executive Research Forum, or NOBLE, they're mm-hmm. trying to gear what they call farming earlier, going upstream, to expose younger children to the realities of law enforcement, mm-hmm. so that they don't get tainted by only being on the receiving end of the citation, and right. pursue it as a career. Honestly, I think one of the biggest problems that happened in law enforcement when they required CALEA, the Commission on Accreditation of Law Enforcement Agencies, made a college degree requirement for entry into law enforcement. Now, mm-hmm. I'm not trying to slam anybody that has a college degree.
Mm-hmm.
What I am saying is, if I have already gone through college and got my degree in whatever my discipline was, you're going to have to sell me to become a law enforcement officer, because if I got a degree in engineering and I need to go back to get my master's or PhD, I can make a lot more money and not have anybody threatening me.
Right. Sure can.
So that's too far down the stream to try to get somebody in.
Right.
When I first came on the state police, the only requirement you had to have was a high school diploma or GED. I retired as a lieutenant in charge of a statewide program. Now, granted, I got schooling along the way, but that wasn't a requirement for walking in the door.
Right.
And to make that a requirement, maybe I would have got my degree in art and got my cartooning going.
Went elsewhere, yeah.
Yeah. So I think while I like the professionalism, the perception of professionalism that a degree gives, it is not the be-all and end-all for a law enforcement officer. Mm-hmm. Common sense isn't that common, and that's where we need it. The folks who can think on their feet, not necessarily take a test.
I agree with that. Which leads me into my next question with you. As far as recruiting and going out, you mentioned going upstream and Camp Cadet and getting younger kids exposed to law enforcement. How fruitful, how beneficial do you think a career today, if someone would start applying today, a younger male or female, white, black, or indifferent, would want to start applying for a job in law enforcement? How beneficial do you think that would be for them?
Immeasurable. The benefits far outweigh the drudgery, and I'm not talking about the monetary benefits. I'm talking about the acts of service you do every day. Most of what law enforcement does is prevention, and you can't document that.
That's true.
When the patrol car goes around the neighborhood, there's no crimes being committed right then at that moment near that car. It might have happened just before, and it might happen soon after, but that presence is not something you can document. But the more that presence is felt or perceived, the less likely those criminal activities occur, and the higher the quality of life for those in that area. When I was a kid growing up, we had beat cops, folks that actually walked. I knew the name of the police. I can't remember him, but I knew there was a police officer in my neighborhood. I didn't see one that looked like me until I was much along in age. But and remarkably, he was a mounted patrol officer for the Fairmount. It was a Fairmount Park, largest municipally owned park in the country. And detailed the Philadelphia Police Department that rode horses throughout the park.
Okay.
And I met one of those guys. He didn't live too far from me when I was growing up. I was enthralled. I love horses. I never wanted to be a mounted police officer, but I love horses. Maybe that's why I like motorcycles. I don't know, but it is a rewarding career in that the only time, especially in the larger agencies, the only time you're ever going to get bored with what you're doing is if you stop applying yourself to do something. If I didn't like patrol, I could apply for a specialty position. If I didn't like the specialty position I was in, I could apply for someplace else. And for the middle to large agencies, that flexibility still exists. Now, smaller departments, there's going to be a problem, but then the impact you have on the community that you serve is priceless. I mean, not everybody's going to be Andy of Mayberry.
Right.
But you can affect that kind of quality of life in the community that you serve if you do it with integrity, if you do it with fairness, if you do it with appreciation of the folks that are around you. And it's not so much an us versus the them mentality. So I encourage a lot of folks to get into it. I can't say I'm going to get a set of steak knives for all those who apply, but every chance I get, I keep telling folks, it's a great career. It is something that you can do that's both rewarding for you, beneficial for you financially, but it's a good thing for your community, especially if you are employed where you live. And that's another hurdle, but something that needs to work out with most agencies now, the residency requirements. There was a time you couldn't apply for a state trooper's position if you didn't live in Pennsylvania. That's changed, but you're going to have to live in Pennsylvania once you come in.
I got you. I know there were certain departments that had residency requirements for that actual township, city, or borough. And me personally, I wasn't a big fan of that because regardless on my situation now, I wasn't a big fan because it seemed like when I want to be off, I want to be off. I don't want to have to, I don't want people coming to my house asking me work-related questions. I want to just unwind. However, I do believe that living in an area nearby, close proximity to where if you had an emergency happen, you were able to get there, or you were still far enough away where you could relax, but close enough where you were still effective.
Right. And for the municipal agencies, that's a challenge for them because they don't have the largest geographic footprint. I mean, think about it. Harrisburg is not that big. Susquehanna Township is not that big. Lower Paxton Township is not that big. So to require everybody to have to live in that geographic area can be an obstacle. Especially if you can find the house that you wanted, the house that your wife or children fell in love with, the school district that you want, that's not quite in your township.
Right.
So How they address that, I don't know. But on the other hand, I don't want somebody that lives
I agree. Yeah.
60 miles away from me that has no vested interest in the quality of the life there be coming in, because then it almost becomes the us and them mentality from the start. And it doesn't have to be.
Yep. I agree there. Yep. 100%. We had a dynamic conversation, and I know I learned a lot. I know a lot of people have gleaned a lot, dropping pearls of knowledge here. Before we wrap up here, is there anything through the course of conversation that we may have forgot or skipped over? Anything else that you would like to share right now? The floor is yours.
Okay. I usually do a little homework before I start talking about this, because I retired in 2009, and law enforcement has changed dramatically in that time frame. There are approximately just shy of 325,000 police officers in the United States. Of that, the majority of those departments are between 5 to 25, maybe 65 person agencies. While there is always going to be a need for law enforcement, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be in a big city to make an impact. What it does mean is that, and I guess I've been saying it repeatedly, if you don't have a service mentality to be of service to others, this is not the job for you. This is not a profession for you. If you want to be the person that helps somebody else's life, especially at their lowest moment, then this is the profession that you need to be in. You'll find nothing more rewarding. You'll find nothing that you'll sleep at night feeling good that I helped somebody. I helped somebody get through something. Yeah, it's not fun giving a death notice to a spouse that somebody got killed in a motorcycle or car crash. It's not fun, but to be the person that can empathize with them and help them through the process, or when someone broke into their house or stole their car, to be that person that can give them a sense that, yes, my world just got shook, but my world still cares about me. And when you're in that uniform, you represent to that person what that world is. My world was rocked. Help me get my world back. And that's what you're there for. There's nothing more rewarding than that, to me.
Right.
If I was able to still work beyond my 60 years, which you can't as a Pennsylvania State police officer, you have to retire at 59 and 364 days. There's no such thing as a 60-year-old state trooper. Administrative code way back when said that's the way it has to be.
Right.
But if I could have, I would have. I'm not running down the street jumping over fences, but I can help somebody through whatever those tough moments are. And that's what I would encourage anybody that's looking for law enforcement. Get an idea on what it actually is, and forget about what you see on TV. Everything on television is not accurate.
Exactly.
But there's much more to it. There's much more interesting in it. The disciplines are wide and varied, and there's a spot in there, whether you're Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, whether you're male or female, there's a spot where you can make a difference, an important difference in somebody's life. It may not be on the headlines, but for that person, it's their headline, and it'll change their life.
You've affected their life. Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Byron, for sharing your thoughts and your wisdom upon us. Thank you for spending time with us. I had a wonderful conversation with you, and I'm pretty sure everyone else did too. I hope you enjoyed yourself. Learned a tremendous deal from you. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, make sure you guys tune in. we're going to continue on with Black and Blue. We're going to interview more. We're going to learn more. We're going to get deep into the conversation, and we're going to continue to have fun as we educate ourselves, whether it's someone who's wanting to be in law enforcement, someone who's a rookie in law enforcement, a seasoned officer who's currently working, and a retiree. There's so many different viewpoints, and they're all important, and we're going to get that information out there. Thank you guys for tuning in. We love you all. Have a good night. Peace.
Take care.
I can't believe people leave their car doors unlocked. I found credit cards, debit cards, and social security cards. It's like stealing candy from a baby.
Aha! I caught you.
Party pooper, be safe. You can't stop me. I know my rights. I'm just walking around here.
Listen, ladies and gentlemen, the days of Mayberry are pretty much over. I'll take Rob You Blind to jail. However, he will be back. It's important to keep all your doors locked and your valuables secured, because Rob You Blind will take full advantage of crimes of opportunity. So remember to take the extra step and lock your stuff up. And that's your tip of the day from Sergeant Be Safe.
Subscribe now.